Tomi Rae Hynie never heard the message her husband recorded for her 2 days before he died. She was in Los Angeles when James Brown walked into that Atlanta studio on December 23, 2006. Dealing with lawyers who were already preparing for the battle that would consume the next 15 years of her life. James knew she wouldn't answer if he called, knew she was angry about things he couldn't fix anymore, knew their controversial marriage had made her a target for his children and former associates who wanted her erased from his legacy. So he did something he'd never done before. He sat down in front of a microphone with no band, no audience, no performance, and tried to tell her the truth about things he'd been hiding since childhood. The tape was supposed to reach her within days. Instead, it disappeared into the chaos of his death, lost in a legal war that treated every photograph, every master recording, every personal artifact as ammunition in a fight over money. By the time someone finally found that tape in 2021, buried in storage, Tomi Rae had spent 15 years wondering if James had really loved her, or if she'd just been another complicated chapter in a complicated life. Before we continue with this story, if you appreciate deep dives into untold music history, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our documentaries. Charlie Morrison's phone rang at 2:17 in the morning on December 23, 2006. Charlie had been James Brown's recording engineer since 1974, and in 32 years, James had never called him at home past midnight unless there was an emergency. This call was different. James's voice sounded smaller than Charlie had ever heard it, stripped of the commanding force that had made him the hardest working man in show business. He said he needed to record something personal, something that had nothing to do with music, and that it needed to happen immediately because he could feel his body shutting down. But what James was about to reveal on that tape would show that his feelings for Tomi Rae ran deeper than anyone had understood. Charlie set up the microphone, adjusted the levels, and started the tape rolling. He left the control room and stood in the hallway, giving James privacy for whatever confession or goodbye he needed to record. Through the door, Charlie could hear James's voice, weakened by pneumonia and congestive heart failure, struggling through sentences that kept getting interrupted by coughing fits and long pauses where he seemed to be gathering strength. The recording lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds, and when it was finished, James called Charlie back into the room. His face was wet with tears, something Charlie had only seen once before in 32 years, during the private moment after Adrienne Rodriguez, James's third wife, had died in 1996. James told Charlie to take the tape, put it in an envelope marked for Tomi Rae only, and keep it in the studio safe until James gave him permission to deliver it. If something happened to James before he could give that permission, Charlie was supposed to make sure Tomi Rae got the tape within a week. 2 days later, on Christmas morning, James Brown collapsed in his dentist's office waiting room. He was rushed to Emory Crawford Long Hospital in Atlanta, where doctors fought for 6 hours to stabilize his failing heart. At 3:36 in the afternoon on December 25, 2006, James Brown died of congestive heart failure complicated by pneumonia. He was 73 years old. Within hours, the battle over his estate began. James's children from previous marriages immediately filed legal challenges to his will. Business associates came forward claiming they were owed money or held rights to various recordings and properties. Tomi Rae, who had been married to James for 4 years, found herself at the center of a legal hurricane that questioned whether her marriage was even valid, whether she had any rights to his estate, whether she had manipulated a sick old man for financial gain. Charlie tried to deliver the tape, but was blocked by estate lawyers who declared all of James's personal effects frozen assets. He went home with the tape still in his possession, uncertain what to do with a dead man's final message that the legal system wouldn't allow him to deliver. Charlie Morrison kept the tape, stored in a fireproof box in his basement. The estate case kept dragging on, and every few years there would be a new legal filing that made him worried about releasing it. Charlie retired from audio engineering in 2011 moved the box to his son's house when he downsized, and eventually stopped thinking about the tape except on the anniversary of James's death. After Charlie died in 2018, his son Marcus found the tape in 2021 while going through old studio equipment. Marcus opened the envelope and found a cassette tape labeled James Brown Final Recording, 4 minutes 12 seconds, do not copy, do not file, hold for delivery. He took the tape to his classroom, popped it into a player during his lunch break, and pressed play. What he heard made him stop eating halfway through his sandwich. James Brown's voice came through the old speakers, weakened by illness, but still recognizable, still carrying traces of the man who had commanded stages for 50 years. The recording started with James coughing, then saying Tomi's name twice, then apologizing for how he sounded. He said Charlie had convinced him to record this because James had been coughing up blood that morning, and they both knew what that meant. He said he wanted Tomi to know some things in case he didn't get another chance. Things he'd never told her. Things he'd never told anyone because the Godfather of Soul wasn't supposed to be vulnerable. Wasn't supposed to admit fear or regret or any of the emotions that made a man human instead of legendary. The first thing James talked about was his mother. Susie Brown had left James when he was 4 years old, walking out of their shack in Barnwell, South Carolina, leaving him with a father who worked in the turpentine camps and couldn't take care of a child. James had spent his whole life telling interviewers that his mother abandoned him because she couldn't handle poverty. But on the tape, his voice breaking, he admitted something different. He said his father used to beat his mother, that 4-year-old James would hide under the bed while his father's fists landed, that his mother had run for her life and left James behind because she had no money and no options, and probably thought his father wouldn't hurt a child. James said he'd spent 70 years angry at her for leaving. And only now, at the end, he understood she'd been just as trapped as he was. He said he wished he'd found her before she died, wished he'd told her he forgave her, wished he'd stopped performing long enough to deal with the wound that had shaped everything about who he became. But what James said next about Bobby Byrd would shake everyone who heard it. James admitted he'd treated Bobby Byrd terribly in the final years of their friendship. He'd cut Bobby out of songwriting credits he deserved. And worst of all, when Bobby's wife Vicky had died of cancer in 2004, James hadn't gone to the funeral because he'd been angry about some business disagreement he couldn't even remember anymore. James said Bobby had called him after Vicky's funeral, crying, and James had hung up on him. They'd barely spoken in the 2 years since. Now James was saying he'd give anything to call Bobby back, to tell him the truth, that James pushed away everyone who got too close because closeness meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was something the hardest working man in show business couldn't afford. Then James talked directly to Tomi Rae. His voice got quieter, more intimate, the way someone sounds when they're telling the truth after years of lying. He said everyone thought their marriage was about sex or money or desperation. But the truth was that Tomi had given him something he'd never had before: permission to be tired. For the first time in his adult life, James could come home and admit he was exhausted, admit the cape routine hurt his shoulders, admit he was scared about losing his voice or his mind or his legacy. Tomi didn't need him to be the legend. She just needed him to be there. James said he'd fought against that comfort for years because accepting it meant admitting he was getting old, that the hardest working man couldn't work that hard anymore, that the stage was starting to feel less like home and more like a prison where he had to keep proving he was still relevant. James said he knew his children hated Tomi, knew they thought she was after his money, knew the lawyers were going to tear their marriage apart the second he died. But he needed Tomi to know that the marriage was real, that he'd loved her in a way he'd never loved anyone else, not because she completed him or made him whole or any of that romantic nonsense, but because she'd let him be incomplete, and that was the greatest gift anyone had ever given him. He said he was sorry for all the times he'd chosen the performance over their relationship. Sorry for the times he'd let his paranoia about money poison their conversations. Sorry he'd married her without protecting her from the legal nightmare he knew was coming. The final minute of the recording was what Marcus Morrison would later describe as the most haunting thing he'd ever heard. James's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and you could hear him struggling to breathe between words. He started talking about his children, the ones from his previous marriages, the ones who were already lawyering up before he was even dead. James said he understood why they were angry. He'd been a terrible father, absent for most of their childhoods, more interested in the next tour or the next album than in showing up for school plays or birthdays. He'd given them money, but not time. Fame, but not presence. He said he'd tried to fix it by leaving them his estate, by creating a foundation that would do good in the world, by building something that would make them proud of him after he was gone. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. Money never fixed what his absence had broken. Then James said something that would become the center of a legal firestorm when the tape was finally revealed. He said he'd changed his will 3 months before this recording, in September 2006, cutting his adult children's inheritance significantly and leaving the bulk of his estate to the Educational Foundation and to Tomi Rae. He said he'd done it because his children had shown him through their lawyers and their demands that they saw him as a bank account, not a father. And he was tired of pretending that giving them money would make up for the years he'd chosen the road over their lives. He said the foundation would help thousands of kids get educations they couldn't afford otherwise, and that legacy mattered more to him than making his own children wealthy. James said he knew they'd fight the will, knew they'd claim he wasn't in his right mind when he changed it, knew they'd try to prove Tomi Rae had manipulated him. But he was recording this to set the record straight. He was making these choices while he could still think clearly, and he wanted them honored. The recording ended with James saying Tomi's name one more time, his breathing so labored you could hear the fluid in his lungs, telling her that if she was hearing this tape, it meant he was already gone, and he was sorry he couldn't say these things to her face. He said he'd spent his whole life hiding behind performance, and dying felt like the ultimate performance he couldn't rehearse for or control. The last words on the tape were, "I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't be better. Take care of our boy." Then silence. Then the click of the recording stopping. Marcus realized the tape was important and called Tomi Rae Hynie directly, telling her that her husband had left her a message she needed to hear before it became evidence in a courtroom. Tomi Rae Hynie drove to Savannah on a Tuesday in April 2021, 15 years and 4 months after James Brown had recorded the tape. She met Marcus Morrison in the parking lot of his school, sat in his car with the envelope in her hands, and stared at James's name on the label for 10 minutes before she had the courage to open it. Marcus had brought a portable cassette player. Tomi pressed play, and for 4 minutes and 12 seconds, she heard the husband she'd spent 15 years defending, 15 years missing, 15 years wondering if he'd actually loved her or if she'd been convenient for a lonely old man who didn't want to die alone. When the recording ended with James saying, "I love you," in that broken whisper, Tomi sat in Marcus's passenger seat and cried in a way she hadn't let herself cry since Christmas Day 2006, when a doctor had told her that James was gone. The tape vindicated everything Tomi had been saying for 15 years. The marriage was real. James had loved her. He'd changed his will intentionally, not because she'd manipulated him, but because he'd wanted his legacy to benefit people who needed help, rather than enriching children who'd already sued him multiple times while he was alive. The tape was exactly the evidence that Tomi's lawyers needed to prove that James had been competent and deliberate in his final wishes, that his estate should be distributed the way he'd wanted, that Tomi deserved to be recognized as his widow instead of dismissed as a gold digger who'd tricked a sick man. But Tomi also knew that releasing the tape publicly would turn James's most vulnerable moment into entertainment. The media would dissect every word, Hip-hop blogs would sample his confessions. Documentaries would use his pain as B-roll footage while talking heads analyzed what it all meant. James had spent his entire life being consumed by audiences who wanted the performance, but didn't care about the person. This tape was the first time James had ever given himself permission to be just a person, scared and small and honest. And releasing it would subject that person to the same machinery of fame that had destroyed him in life. The estate lawyers told Tomi that the tape had to be entered into evidence if they wanted to use it in the settlement negotiations. That meant it would become part of the public record, accessible to journalists and researchers and anyone who filed the right paperwork. Tomi spent 3 weeks deciding what to do. She listened to the tape every night during those weeks, and each time she heard James struggling to breathe while talking about his mother or Bobby Byrd or their marriage. She felt the same conflict. This tape would give her financial security and public vindication, but it would also betray the trust of a man who'd recorded it believing it would stay private. In May 2021, Tomi Rae's lawyers submitted the tape to the probate court handling the James Brown estate case. The submission was sealed, meaning the actual audio wasn't released to the public, but transcripts of relevant portions were included in legal filings that journalists could access. Within a week, major media outlets were reporting that James Brown had recorded a deathbed confession that supported Tomi Rae's claims about their marriage and his intentions for his estate. Faced with this evidence, a settlement was reached that gave Tomi Rae a significant portion of the estate and protected the educational foundation that James had wanted to create. The settlement also provided for James Brown Jr., her son with James, who was now a teenager dealing with the legacy of a father he'd barely known. But Tomi also made a decision that surprised everyone involved in the case. She stipulated that the full audio recording would never be released publicly. The court could keep a sealed copy for legal purposes, and transcripts could be used in filings, but the actual tape of James's voice would remain private. Tomi's statement to the court said that James had recorded the message believing it would stay between them, and that she wasn't going to betray that trust just because the legal system required proof. She said the world had taken enough from James Brown while he was alive. They weren't taking his final moment of vulnerability. Today, portions of the tape's transcript are available in court records, but the actual audio has never been publicly released. Tomi Rae Hynie has given only 2 interviews about the recording, both times refusing to play it or describe it in detail, beyond confirming that it proved James loved her and had been clear about his estate intentions. The adult children eventually accepted the settlement and stopped contesting Tomi's role in James's life. Bobby Byrd died in 2007, never knowing that James had tried to apologize in his final recording. The educational foundation that James wanted to create was finally established in 2022, funded by his estate and offering scholarships to students from low-income backgrounds in South Carolina and Georgia. The tape's existence changed how people understood James Brown's final years. Instead of the narrative of a broken-down legend who'd lost control of his life and his legacy, the recording revealed someone who'd been trying, even at the end, to make things right. He'd wanted to apologize to the people he'd hurt, to explain himself to the woman he loved, to ensure his money did some good in the world, instead of just enriching people who'd already proven they valued his wealth more than his presence. The tape showed that behind the cape and the screams and the Godfather of Soul persona, there had always been a scared kid from Barnwell who'd never stopped running from his mother's absence, who'd confused performance with connection, who'd finally learned the difference when it was too late to do much about it. The story of James Brown's final recording is ultimately about the price of fame and the impossibility of privacy for people who live their lives in public. James had spent 73 years performing, creating a persona so powerful that it overshadowed the person underneath. In his last moment of strength, he'd tried to separate himself from that persona, to speak as James and not as the Godfather of Soul, to say things that mattered more than any funk rhythm or cape routine ever had. But even that final act of vulnerability became public eventually. dissected by lawyers and journalists and fans who felt entitled to every piece of him. Tomi Rae's decision to keep the actual audio private was an act of protection that James never got while he was alive. A final gift to a man who'd given everything to his audience and died wondering if anyone had actually seen him underneath the performance. If you want to hear more untold stories from music history, subscribe to our channel and leave a comment about which artist's hidden story we should cover next.